Hello, Natalie, come join me. Hello.
Hello.
Hello, everybody. Good evening, good day, good morning, good night, wherever you are. Hello to everyone in Het House and everyone who's at home or wherever you are streaming in. Welcome to the Conditional Values panel with myself, Tobias Revel, and
Myself, Natalie Kane.
And together we are global super brand Haunted Machines who work together on various curatorial projects and have worked with IMPAKT Festival for a number of years now, including curating the 2017 edition, Haunted Machines and Wicked Problems, that we're wearing vintage IMPAKT merch for. So thank you for joining us. So the Conditional Values panel is about exploring the ways in which we might imagine alternative worlds and alternative norms, structures, systems, and measures of worlds. Natalie and myself started our work together looking at the interaction between technology and the occult. And in the last year or two, we've started to examine more and more the idea of models. So how do people model things and where do they come from? So we're going to use that as the sort of framework to start this panel. And joining us, we've got two amazing artists, artists, researchers, futurists, thinkers, doers, makers, Dr. Pinar Yoldas and Monica Bielskiuta. And they're going to be joining us after our initial presentation with to talk about some of their work and some of their ideas and some of the things that they've been doing. And at the end, we're going to go into a discussion. So I'm just going to start screen sharing because the format we're using today is a little different. In discussing how we were going to go about this process, Natalie and I both agreed that we were, we were a bit done with the tried and tested kind of Zoom panel presentation of whacking up a couple of slides and then going through it. And since this panel is about models and what it means to make models and the world and the structures underlying the world, we thought we'd use a spreadsheet. No, Natalie, carry on, please do.
No, I wanted to kind of, so this is basically off the idea of party in the spreadsheet, which a friend of mine, Marie Fulston, who is a curator of video games and other kind of playful things, and I went to a party in a spreadsheet and had a lot of fun and really liked that as a model of thinking through different types of interactive experiences. So that's kind of where this came from, and we wanted to try it as a different way of modeling a talk and wanted to invite you to explore this with us. So this is our first time doing this, so it's an experiment for us as anything else. So we'll see what happens. But no, go ahead, Twice. I just wanted to kind of drop in where we got this idea from as much as anything else. So
and I suppose that although often the way we tell stories about the way things are take a linear form, the world is rarely in a linear form, and so using a spreadsheet was an interesting way to explore another way of representing the research we've been doing and thinking about, as well as sort of almost critiquing the idea of the spreadsheet in the first place. So we've put together these sheets, as have our two other panelists, and we're going to use those to present with. And then when we come to the discussion period of the presentation, which will probably be in about 30 minutes or so, 35 minutes, we invite people who have tickets and have the interact function to come and join us as well in the spreadsheet, where they can sort of edit, put in some ideas, put in some links, respond to things that are in the sheets in their own time. So we'll get to that when we get to that. But I guess for now, Natalie and I are going to begin by laying out some context before introducing our next few panelists. So I think in our sheet, Natalie, we're going to start in the bottom right with our bit on sort of spreadsheets and measurements and things, aren't we?
Yeah, so we're going to start kind of where it all began. I'm letting Tobias drive.
Yeah.
Mostly because I can't be trusted to drive. I can't drive, so that's fine. And we're going to start. So I'm going to let Tobias talk about the census.
Yeah. So the use of spreadsheets and forms of accounting to measure power is sort of one of the oldest we have. Certainly, some of the oldest pieces of written material we have from human civilization are cuneiform tablets that are accountancy. But if we go into sort of colonial era Europe, 19th century, you have this enormous rise of census work and the work of state administration that leads to the modeling, the tracking, and the accounting of what the resources of a state are. And this is particularly pertinent during the Napoleonic Wars, when states were obviously in a period of advance and ongoing conflict. So in this particular instance, actually, it's not from Europe, but it's from the United States. And this is, to the best of my knowledge, someone may know different, the first census taken from South Carolina, and I believe it's I can't even see the date on it anymore, 1836, 18 something. But the interesting thing about this is, much like all the very first censuses that were taken, the first one in the UK was in 1901, the thing they were mostly interested in was fighting age men. That was what was being measured here, was basically how many men of an age that were able to take up arms were in the state, and so could be used as a military might. And that's quite an interesting project, because with this information, states sort of wage an administrative war on each other. They can document their manpower, and therefore their military might, and therefore they can sort of inform enemies of their kind of ability to wage war effectively. And this obviously is a kind of similar situation to what we had in the Cold War, where sort of, reports and missives on the amount of stockpiled munitions by the East and the West were flying back and forth. This becomes a proxy for sort of intrastate conflict, this idea of measuring manpower and this accounting of what the sort of resources are. And that, of course, that logic continues in today. So Natalie, you've popped some things in here.
Yeah, I mean, what I want to also note as well, if you scroll left and down slightly, this is where it's driving, is actually the way that, because this is from the southern states of America, and there's a few kind of cross references here that we have to acknowledge, is the way that, zoom out.
Okay.
So Caitlin Rosenthal, this quote that I've just popped in the bottom, wrote a book about accounting for slavery, which is Masters of Management on Plantation Records. What you also notice is the way that this links, and the way that census data was taken during that time also account of the way that plantations were acknowledged, and slavery was also kind of acknowledged. While censuses were being taken, you also had this management system being kind of simultaneously being adapted and used for slave data and for plantation data, which was also being used kind of predating census time as well. This is already quite a sophisticated use of essentially accounting for the people that you thought that at that time you had the right to own, which was obviously a horrific and bad history of our kind of culture. And so if you look in this column, actually there is a line for slaves. That's one of the people, kind of the groups of people that are accounted for here. Caitlin Rosenthal wrote this really excellent book about the basically the history of business management being in the States, being entirely kind of built around slavery, a lot of it being built around slavery. And she talks about the fact that a lot of these plantation grids and the way that they're written around and the ownership of people look like an antiquarian version of Excel. And it's worth looking at that alongside the kind of the formation of those things. So it's interesting to look at how those things are pulled together, and the fact that, again, a lot of these management styles are not kind of, we need to look at those histories as much as we look at them when they start to kind of organize data and think about numbers and data or anything else. And then look almost, I don't know, 1977, 100 years time, 100 years forward, you then have the invention of VisiCalc, which is the first actual computational piece of organizational software, which was created by, I need to get the names right because I keep getting their surnames, because men's surnames I always just forget. They're just Dan and Bob, which is what they were. So Dan Bricklin and Bob Frankson, who invented VisiCalc specifically for the Apple II. Which was the first killer app that has ever been acknowledged. I think that they now say it definitely was. So the Apple II was created in 1977 by Steve Jobs and Wozniak, and it was created as kind of, it was seen as the first kind of breakthrough computer to really make it on a commercial market. And VisiCalc was developed shortly afterwards, and it was the killer app because it was obviously the thing that really rocketed Apple II into being super commercial, because you bought the Apple II to get VisiCalc. It was like a spreadsheet app. It basically allowed you to do accounting at home and in whatever. And it had a really short run until Lotus came along shortly afterwards. But the fact that it was super important, actually had some really amazing, again, Apple had some of the most successful and amazing marketing of its time. But I really like this advert in particular because of how it phrases the way that you were able to manage and controlled data. So it says how to turn a sea of data into data you can see. The idea that suddenly all these things that you had to use with your hands or you had to like type out manually into a typewriter could suddenly be managed by a computer. It wasn't super sophisticated, but at the time it was mind-blowing. And that, again, as a piece of software you could buy, was super important and made things easier, apparently, for everyone.
Yeah, and I suppose, you know, we're going to move on into the idea of how does this connect to the theme of this year's impact around the world and ecologies, and how we relate to our ecology, or how we are inside our ecology more accurately, because we don't really own it. But, you know, it's a lot of this work that is alluded to in both of those things are very much about who decides what is entered into the spreadsheet. So in the case of South Carolina censuses, it's slaves. In the case of Napoleonic era censuses, it's manpower. But ultimately, no matter how good the system is, the biases that inform what goes into the data and what data is seen as valuable are what's going to shape the model of reality that comes out the other side. So the work, for instance, of Mimi Onahua, I don't know if Natalie, if you want to talk about this a bit, the Missing Datasets project.
I can talk really briefly. I mean, so just kind of this quote that I've put down here from Lisa Guthman, as Tobias was mentioning. So Lisa Guthman and Virginia Jackson wrote a really great essay called "Raw Data is an Oxymoron." This quote kind of basically, just to sort of very briefly talk about it, data needs to be imagined as data to exist and function as such. Very briefly means that we decide what data is, and then when that data is, we decide what it is, then that becomes data, in the same way that when we decide what we're going to put into a spreadsheet, that's what becomes data and therefore becomes processed, and then that has an impact on the world. So Mimi Onahua's the Library of Missing Dataset is a huge acknowledgement of the things that are missing or not accounted for. So it's I've just pulled out a quote from how she describes it, because she describes it really well, which is the blank spots that exist in spaces that are otherwise data saturated. So it's looking at things like people that are excluded from public housing because of criminal records, undocumented immigrants currently incarcerated, all of the things that are not currently, there isn't enough information about, because it's either being chose to be willfully kind of ignored or not looked at, because it's not being seen to have an incentive to be regarded as data or to be kind of cared about. But she also makes a really important point that there are some things that perhaps shouldn't be kind of watched or data for the protection of those people. She makes a really good point about the advantage of non-existence, particularly for people who are being watched by state actors. So a good example of that is around facial recognition. So why would you want to make facial recognition better for Black people if they're the ones who are currently being watched the most by state actors, that kind of thing. And it links again back to if you go down to the bottom example, things like predpol, for instance. So predpol is a big example about how data and the historic of racial bias around database management has actually shaped area, or is looking to shape areas, and particularly the way that areas and mapped areas see themselves, and the way that police areas, areas are policed, sorry. So predpol, for those who don't know it, is a predictive analytics software that is currently being, I think it's being rolled out, or it's being rolled out particularly in certain areas, as a way for people to know, in a sort of, again, I hate to bring up Minority Report, because Minority Report always comes out and talks somewhere when we talk about future or technology. It's basically a software that will tell you where crime will happen next, based on, I think the Vice report that came out about this said that it's based on the last 3 to 10 years of crime in that area. And the sheer fact that, if you look at statistics like the fact that police shootings between around 2011 and 2015 found that police shootings will target Black suspects 3.49 times more than white suspects, because of racial biases that there are existing in policing. That essentially means that those targeting data will then become data, which will then become predictive data, which will then decide how the area is policed, and it will decide how those people and the area see themselves, as much as other people, like police actors, will then choose to see that area as well. So it then determines how that area is seen, both from a kind of social and political point of view, but also a psychological view as well, and a social view. And that's where the impact of databases starts to become, and the way that those spaces are formed, start to have that very social and political and psychological role of anything else.
And I think one of the things that we come across repeatedly is this idea that the models you make of the world in order to try and understand it simply reinforce themselves and create the same behaviors again, as we see in predictive policing. James C. Scott is a sort of writer we come back to a lot in this, and he probably put it very well in his book, Seeing Like a State, where he tried to articulate this project of abstracting the world. He describes it here as the utopian, imminent, and continually frustrated goal to reduce the chaotic, disorderly, constantly changing social reality beneath it, the state, to something more closely resembling the administrative grid of its observations. So Scott and others have described this project of abstracting the world into a database, into a model, based on whatever you need to know, whether it's slaves, armaments, crime hotspots, that kind of thing, and then reprojecting power back into the world based on that model, even though that model is necessarily a reduced version of the world. And we actually see this in benign things or semi-benign things like containerization, the project of making products and physical material able to move in a shipping container, because shipping containers conform to a fixative dimension in their size and weight and scale that means they can easily be transported, to more utopian, well, more imaginative projects. And perhaps Monica will address the utopianness or non-utopianness of something like Cybersign, or in fact, Gosplan, which was the Soviets' equivalent of the idea of a completely centrally planned state that had total access to all the available information of everything that was produced and consumed in that state, and so they could consequently make decisions. And obviously all these projects failed for various ideological and economic reasons.
I mean, there's a quote from Levmanovich as well that you just pointed out, was the fact that the issue with things like databases is then the way that narrative works. That essentially database kind of tries to push things like people and objects, the things that ultimately kind of aren't things that are naturally, I mean, I use natural in a very kind of abstract way, but like the things that are very difficult to order, the things that naturally kind of don't and perhaps aren't meant to be. And when we try to kind of order them, the narrative doesn't quite, we create a narrative that about them that don't quite make sense. And who decides that narrative and who decides to interpret the narrative suddenly matters massively, because of what is then left out, or what we choose to, or how we choose to interpret it suddenly becomes really super essential and important.
So this brings us on to the specifics of this year's impact, and I suppose actually it brings us full circle in the history of this project, because we can trace, we're not going to do it right now, but we can trace the current logics of computer science into ecological mapping. So the early development of computers and computer science was very much around the idea of mapping natural phenomena, whether it was simulating weather for meteorological analysis, or tracking animals, for instance, in areas of forest, or measuring, as James C. Scott actually talks about in his book as well, forestry yields, so how much wood can be produced given a certain area. We find the origins of computation enmeshed with measuring and modeling natural or previously natural phenomena and attempting to control them. And of course, with the accepted science of climate change, we now know that we're now using computation increasingly to try and create increasingly realistic models in order to create policy and awareness around the subject. So we're all familiar with things like heat maps of the Earth, attempting to model the changes that are happening in the climate. But more interestingly, the stuff we've looked at, well, it's not more interesting, but it's also interesting. And in terms of some of the things we've been looking at are the ways that we choose to visualize the planet in different ways, and the expediencies necessary in using a computer to visualize the planet. So, for instance, Google Earth is well known for having these kind of humorously flattened and misrepresented areas due to the method of photography that's used that sort of flatten the complexities of the Earth into quite simple and rudimentary objects in order that someone could load them on their desktop computer. Lara Chapman, in an excellent article for Real Life called Springtime Everywhere, writes about the fact that to Google, it's really important that the Earth is captured in its most idyllic setting. So it's always spring, it's always perfect lighting, it's always no cloud cover. There's never any sort of smoke cover from fires, for example, in the West Coast. It's always an idealized version of the Earth that's captured and then is almost explored in a sort of disaster tourism way by people now at home during lockdown, who are now exploring parts of the Earth. And it's a very interesting article in arguing against Graphic Ambivalence by Nicole Sanson-Ruiz, brilliant paper, which I read the other day. She talks about the actual people involved in modeling the Earth and how they make decisions as people who have two concerns, one of which is aesthetic. It needs to look good so that people will actually use the model, but it also needs to work. And so they necessarily have to make reductions to the accuracy of what they're doing in order for it to fit on a computer. And we can see similar decisions. I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to speed up a bit, Natalie, if that's all right. We can see some of these decisions, for example, in the beginning of like scientific visualization. So this is a brilliant, this is the first MRI scan from Aberdeen University in 1974, which is of a mouse. And of course, when the MRI scan was done, the machine spat out cells of numbers, and then the scientists, arbitrarily chose to use this color scheme. A color scheme we're now deeply familiarized with in terms of heat mapping and intensity mapping. But it was something that was done almost arbitrarily at the time, and these aesthetics start to infuse our arguments and our kind of our visual scientific culture. And of course, many of these, to finish up, I don't know if Natalie's probably got something else to jump on quickly, but these technologies then filter down into real life. So something like Microsoft Flight Simulator, which is released, I think now very shortly, is going to be a pretty phenomenal breakthrough in visualization technology, because it uses live data from Microsoft's kind of Earth modeling ecosystem. So their mapping software, their meteorological software, all the information they're using in order to sort of represent the Earth to consumers for other purposes, they're also now using to completely simulate the Earth for gamers. But of course, they're making these expedient cuts again, having to reduce the Earth into different things. So this scene here is actually Buckingham Palace in London, which you can see has been rendered as an office block because the computer, in order to save space on the player's drive, doesn't bring assets. It kind of generates them from best guesses of what might be there. So Buckingham Palace here, instead of a sort of neoclassical palatial mansion, is a very drab office block from like the mid-90s. These kind of indicate to us like where the decisions are being made by people preparing the software that's being used to model the Earth. The final thing from me is just also a bit of a plug for an artist I'm an enormous fan of. Alan Warburton, who he brought one of his films to IMPAKT in 2017, has really been exploring this relationship between how decisions are made to simulate natural phenomena. So in his video essay, Goodbye Uncanny Valley, he says, computer scientists incrementally created a library of simulated phenomena, and software companies packaged these tools together into multi-purpose 3D animation programs. These suites prioritize certain tasks and outputs. They ship with presets for lights, objects, motions, bodies, and materials. And in his latest work, RGB FAQ, which is currently at Arbeit in London, he examines this further and sort of highlights the ways in which we're entering an age in which the simulations being done in computers are now being used to create policy and real material change in the physical Earth. And all these flaws are now being wrapped up back into sort of building AI, building automated systems and stuff that actually have an effect on our sort of lived experience in material culture, even though they're entirely trained on a simulation. And I guess just to mention as well, spreadsheets can have other uses. I don't know. I mean, I put this in here. I'm sure it's worth saying, when Natalie and I do anything, we always try and do, we're, both sides people, both sides of the fence. Spreadsheets have seen a really interesting use, as have shared documents in the last few months, as forms of activism, as ways of organizing, as ways of sharing information, and as ways of articulating information and ideas to bigger and wider audiences. So in the same way that I guess we're trying to use a sheet in this panel in a bit of a subversive way, they also have a real place in people being able to access and structure their own power through them. Is there anything else to add, Natalie, or should we move on?
I think we should move on. No, I think we've said everything that we can say. I'm just looking forward to.
We've rattled on for too long. All right, we're going to move.
Monica, yeah.
No, it's Pinar first, isn't it?
Yeah, Pinar, then Monica.
We're going to move on to our first panelist, if she's ready. So I'm just going to I'm going to stop sharing and do a quick introduction while she's queuing everything up. So our first panelist is Dr. Pinar Yoldas. I have to get up the bio here, don't I? Dr. Pinar Yoldas is an infradisciplinary designer, artist, researcher, currently based in Ann Arbor in Michigan. Her work develops within biological science.
San Diego.
Is it San Diego now? It's an outdated bio. Her work develops within biological sciences and digital technologies through architectural installations, kinetic sculpture, sound, video, and drawing, with a focus on post-humanism, eco-nihilism, Anthropocene, and feminist technoscience. She's also a mean ZBrusher, and I'm deeply envious of her performance that I follow eagerly on her Instagram. So, yeah, over to you, Pinar.
Okay, so I am going to share my screen right now. Can you all hear me well? Yes. Okay. And I'm going to look at the time here. All right, good. Is it working? All right. So thank you so much for this opportunity. I actually have an ambitious presentation, so I hope it won't be super confusing. The format was excellent. Actually, what I tried to do was NASA has the data sets on global warming on their website. So I wanted to bring it into Excel. You can make your own different representations using this data. But my Excel skills aren't as good as my ZBrush skills. So we're just going to look at some images and discuss global warming's connection to culture. So I think for me, the really big question is what culture is. And I came to this question while I was looking at animal studies. What are the differences between animal cultures and human cultures? And first off, there are a lot of people out there who do not think, or let's use the word believe, that non-human animals could potentially have cultures. There are, again, a lot of people out there who think that non-human animals may not have the same capacity for basic, things like emotions or empathy, etc. So I'm just going to make this big jump and assume that culture is something that we share. It's a quality that we share across different species. And I want to, come to this because today, especially like after, COVID in the summer, we've witnessed a couple cultural movements. I'm speaking from San Diego, where I teach at UC San Diego. And in the American, let's say, cultural environment, cultural climate, it wasn't just elections, that we've had this horrible president in the past 4 years, but also Black Lives Matter was very impactful. And before that, Me Too was very impactful. And I think these movements really highlight and clarify how important culture is, and that it is something a lot more tangible and physical than we perhaps initially thought. So,
Hello, Pinar.
Hello. It seems that we may have lost Pinar.
Uh-oh. We were doing really well until then.
Oh no! It's always the case of working across many time zones and connections. So we may need to have. I mean, this is a case of alternative models. This always happens.
Should we just give it a second and see if she pops back in?
I saw there being an error message on her spreadsheet. Oh, there we go. Okay, so in that case, we may need to have an alternative model in this project around alternative models for spreadsheets. While we're just figuring out where Pinar has gone, we may have to ask Monica in that case to...
Would you be all right to jump on, Monica? Currently muted. So mute you.
Sorry, didn't realize I was muted. Could we give Pinar another minute or so? Because it'd be awkward for me to start presentation and then cut it, and then her so. If she doesn't come back, then
what we can talk about for now is we can just talk about a little bit more about the collaborative spreadsheet, just for everyone while we're waiting for Pinar.
Yeah, I mean, also I just and it's going to get complicated. We did a dress rehearsal and everything. I
have to say that my spreadsheet sort of situation. I'm very much. I don't know how much I believe in astrology, but as a Virgo, I love things very sort of organized. So I've only used spreadsheets in this very kind of conventional way, just putting data together. And so just kind of like, I felt it kind of like kicked into my OCD to put things just kind of like almost just make a layout over a spreadsheet instead of like, put things in a way that, is clearly upon certain order and the system of rules. So my spreadsheet is not as impressive as yours.
No, it's fine. So what we'll do, we'll just talk about the discussion spreadsheet for those who are still who we're waiting for Pinar. So the discussion notes, what we're going to do once we get to the discussion point. So while we're just waiting for our speakers to come back into cyberspace, the discussion section, which we're going to open up once our speakers have finished speaking. So at the point that Monica, our final speaker, has finished speaking, we're going to open up the spreadsheet, and we're going to let all of our willing audience and people who are tuning in via Zoom and people who are interacting on the link, which we will be sharing, which you get through your ticket link. I think that's how it's being pulled through. You will get a chance to come into the spreadsheet, and you can go into any of our speaker presentations, and you can interact. You can either kind of leave a comment on a specific thing that one of us has shared or talked about. You can kind of leave your own link to something else that you thought was interesting. You can even share an image. You can share an image in the discussion notes and ideas one, which is like a specific page, which is this one here. So we've got something else that's being kind of shared right now by some people. Is this you, Tobias?
Well, I was going to say, I put in reminded by something you said, actually. I was reminded of a pretty interesting article that came out last week called How Eugenics Shape Statistics, which was about the fact that a certain university in London, I'm not going to name them on camera, but you can read it, was running basically neo-Nazi kind of statistics, eugenics conferences right up until about 2014 because of the sort of the use of the apparent objectives of statistical science to justify like ethno-nationalism, basically. And that obviously has a huge history that goes right back to that South Carolina census, the idea that you can, and our friend and previous impact speaker, Romana Morrow, also speaks about the role of Leibniz in reinforcing white supremacy in European culture through the use of statistics to kind of try and prove that white people were superior. Pinar says she's switching to another machine. She'll be 1 minute.
Great. So we've got 1 minute to fill some space. Just fine. Me and Tobias love filling space, so it's good. So the idea is that you'll come in, you will leave your comments and your thoughts and your reflections. We ask you to be respectful, treat this as if this is your house, this is your space. If you are naughty, we have some invisible moderators who will go around and do some housekeeping. We will, if it gets out of hand, we will just close the spreadsheet, and then we'll fun for everyone. Be again respectful of other people's comments. We ask that you do not delete anything. The idea is this will be a kind of cultural record of this conversation, and just have fun. You can put GIFs in. We found out. I didn't know you could do that. You can put GIFs in, but you can't put videos in. You can put links to video. You can do if you're one of those people who can do cool stuff with.
I think Pinar's returned to us.
Sorry.
Pinar's returned to us.
What?
Pinar has returned, so we can probably jump back in.
But if you're one of those cool people who can do cool stuff with code and macros and stuff, then that'd be really cool. Yeah, Pinar. So we'll let you go back in.
Right. Apologies, everyone. I honestly don't know what happened, so we'll just continue. Okay. But I need screen sharing.
We will make you co-host. Yeah.
Thank you. Great.
Can I do that? This is all the fun of.
Yep, digital telecommunications. Okay, I still don't have sharing. I can talk. Shall I talk? No slides anyways, right? It's the Excel sheet.
We can do it. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have
and you can
sharing access. Yeah, when you guys, when I have the sharing access, I can just go over the slides, but I'm going to continue reading my notes in the interest of time because I also have Monica.
And now?
Oh, yes, it's working now. All right, cool. So I was looking at culture, right? And I think one thing that I would like everyone to think about is really defining culture. What is this? It's something that affects our emotions, our behavior, our decision making. It affects our closet, like what we wear, like it affects our income, well-being, planetary health. And when we open up the Excel, I want everyone to add to this because I'm curious to hear. But at the same time, culture could be considered an operating system. Computers, as we know it as of 2020, are like a very poor way of explaining, a very poor model of explaining how the human mind and behavior works. But we could kind of think of it that way. But I think another word that I like a lot, and this kind of comes from Investopedia, don't ask me why, is culture could be heuristics, which means it's kind of a very easy way for us. It's the system that helps us make decisions very easily. Now, as of today, watching these cultural movements happen, right, we know that there are a lot of diseases with our culture. There are a lot of things that are not working with our culture. And I think there's a very tight connection between our current global, whatever we will call it, culture and what's happening with the rising temperatures, right? So I'm always like looking for, actually I'm not looking for, but I always find myself looking at images like the ones that I'm showing. I'm really interested in non-human cultures, non-human animal cultures, and I'm very interested in the cultural impact we have on non-human life. I mean, of course, this could be considered kind of an ethical thing to think about, but actually we're going to a point where this issue becomes like really directly related to our survival as a species as well. Not that I care about it that much. We might go to Mars or Venus or whatever, but it's important that we take care of, you know, our own well-being, our own health, but as much as that planetary health. So here are some images, and these are like, I would call them cultural stupidity, actually. One of them is the Faroe Islands. We're still hunting dolphins there. Another thing is we all love eating fish, right? And the byproduct is these ghost nets. If you haven't heard about it, ghost nets are discarded nets that keep catching fish and marine mammals and all kinds of, you know, ending all kinds of life. Another thing that's still happening as of 2020, which I think is a very, you know, let's say call it a cultural cancer, is, oh, that turtle isn't alive, by the way, is, let's say, hunting of wildlife. Why do we hunt wildlife? And I love this. It's the family, I mean, love meaning love, hate this. It's a family picture of, you know, a group of Americans going and like killing that giraffe. And here is a series that I've been sharing on social media. These are cat lovers, right? Unfortunately, these are dead cats. And I'm a big cat lover myself. I work with Kitty AI, who's a cat AI overlord that's going to, you know, be a governor in 2039. So seeing images like this breaks my heart. Well, one thing is we might directly go after non-human life to eat it, or to torture it, or to capture it for whatever cultural reason and belief system we belong to. But then there is also this kind of really unplanned consequences, like things that we build around us that keep catching and hurting wildlife. So I think this is one of the most serious things that's happening as of now. And I just want this culture to change. Now I'm going to come to global warming, Hot Yoga Studio, which is this sessions we've been having in the festival. And thank you so much for installing the global warming hot yoga there. In a nutshell, I'll explain what I'm trying to do with that and how it's connected to culture. Well, I was really hoping that yoga could be a way to change behavior. Let's look at these two images. One of them, you might have seen this on media in 2018. It's a starving polar bear, and at the end of the video, the polar bear, I think, died. National Geographic explorers couldn't really help this. And on the other side is Bikram. So this is a hot yoga phenomenon that kickstarted I think with this guy Bikram, but has taken California by the storm about a decade ago. It's still around. So I was looking at these and thinking about how these two can actually be connected, because they are all dealing with raising temperatures. And another influence I have is Daniel Woolpert, who's a neuroscientist, and he has this lecture where he explains how brains evolved. And according to Daniel Woolpert, brains evolved to affect change on the environment. So movement is why brains evolved. And then if you dig deeper into this, you realize that moving in bodily movements is basically directly connected to our emotions, our physical, not only our physical well-being, but our mental well-being as well. But we all know that already. But he also says that there's one other way of affecting change in the world, which is sweating, right? So I was thinking, can I make an artwork where I actually work directly with people's skin, their sweat glands and their muscles, joints, etc. And I think global warming hot yoga solves that problem. So in the setup, we have lamps that are emitting heat, and we're practicing yoga. It's scripted, and the script is basically bringing to our attention as we're relaxing into the poses, etc., asanas, bringing to our attention what certain philosophers called information dump, meaning the amount of CO2 particles, ppm in the air, or the severity of water pollution, etc. So here are some snapshots from that video. Let me end with, we have culture here, right? And that's the question, let's define culture. And if we can define it successfully, then we can also understand that culture is very malleable. So culture isn't something solid. I'm going to show you two things about that to convince you that culture can change, and that's what actually keeps me, doing what I'm doing. The first one is, we're going to come back to that. Edward Bernays. Edward Bernays is Freud's cousin, and he's a very influential, I think it's called publicist, social influencer of his time from 1940s, and he is the mastermind behind this movement called Torches of Freedom. And this campaign was basically addressed or targeting young women, which wasn't a demographic that typically smoked cigarettes. So the problem Bernays was confronted with is that young women and women in general aren't smoking. Cigarette companies want them to smoke so that they can sell their products to this group. How can we solve this problem? So he created the original influencer, basically, and he recruited some models and actresses and made them literally do a protest while they were smoking in public, which wasn't culturally acceptable at the time. So he changed this culture, of course, with the backup of the advertising and the money coming from tobacco companies. And here are some ads that I found really interesting. And here's one that I find really, really dangerous, right? And what happens is that after Ed Bernays' successful campaigns, right, women started smoking. And then this had an impact. Let's move 20 years to 3 decades. This had an impact on the healthcare system. And the governments and other agencies started thinking of ways in which they could reverse this. And here is a chart explaining the effect of smoking in public healthcare from Netherlands. And this is, campaigns that we see in Europe. We don't have this in the States. And basically, Bernays changed the culture towards making smoking desirable, and then it was reversed. So it's possible, and all of this took about 50 years. Now let's go to plastics, for instance, which is something I work on all the time. And this is from a Life magazine, 1955, where throwaway living and disposable plastics as you know it today has been introduced. And it was this cool new thing. It will save you 40 hours, up to 40 hours in household chores, etc. And here we see an atomic family, is it called, or molecular family? Anyways, a small family celebrating this moment. A funny thing, the face of the child is obscured. And today we are now starting to think of ways in which we can reverse this. But again, culture is malleable. In 50 years ago, we didn't have anything like disposable plastics. So it was a cultural campaign. We need to be aware of that. And to end, I think I'm going to go back to where I came from, non-human animal. One of my favorite neuroscientists, Robert Sapolsky, this is a paper by him, Emergence of a Peaceful Culture in Wild Baboons, also shows us that baboons, which are not matriarchal at all and very, how to say it, aggressive, as kind of that's how their social culture is. After going through not pandemic but a disease which spread to them from eating because they were eating human food leftovers, and took off about 70% of their population, right, within less than how much times to form a new generation, reverted or changed into a much more peaceful culture, which was dominated by females. Most alpha males were wiped out, right? And it was very, very interesting for him to see that what they thought as like this kind of solid, unchanging culture, because it's the social culture of an animal group, did also change into something that was never observed before. So let me see if I have other bits and pieces here, because this is a new format, right? What I'd like you to fill is, when we're done, define culture part. And then I'd like everyone to remember this wonderful Ursula Le Guin quote, right? And I'd like to fill the yellow part if you can think of other things. And I think there are a couple other parts here that you can work on with me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pinar. That was brilliant. Super interesting use of the sheet. I loved it. There's so much stuff in there. Okay, we're going to move on to our last speaker. We're running a little bit over, but the good folks behind the scenes at IMPAKT have granted us some extra time, so we'll still have time for some discussion. Our next speaker is Monika Bielskiuta. I'm going to be sharing my screen, and she's going to be directing me through her presentation. While I get that up, let me just read her bio. So Monika is a futures researcher. She's been on an 8-year journey exploring futures in over 90 countries, and is currently, I believe, in Tunisia. With a specific focus on non-Western perspectives, as a futurist and a futures designer, Monika consults on and prototypes culturally expansive, socially and environmentally engaged future world designs for the media industry, technology companies, and cities and countries. With expertise in the immersive media space and edutainment, her work consists in connecting bleeding-edge technological innovation with some of the world's most original creative visions, that explore the relationship between speculative science fiction narratives, dystopias, utopias, and protopias, which I believe is what we're going to learn a lot more about, and the unfolding global future. So, Monika, if you're ready, I'm going to turn off my camera and you can direct me.
Can we see me? Can you see me all right? Okay. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to participate in this virtual event. Hey, okay. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this. Thank you for all of your words, Pinar, Natalie, Tobias, echoing most of the things that you were saying, and we'll try to sort of continue from there. Tobias, I just wanted to check with you, how much extra time do we have, so I know how long I should make my presentation?
We do have an extra 10 minutes, but I reckon at a push they could let us go a little longer.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so what I wanted to speak about, because it's a short presentation, is really, utopias, dystopias, and the new framework that I've been working on, which is protopia or protopia futures. Why these things are important is, as Pinar was speaking, culture informs everything. It all starts with imagination. You know, a lot of the times people think that it's men, and mostly white men, such as, you know, Elon Musk and Sergey Brin and Jeff Bezos, that are shaping the future. But in fact, if we look into biographies of almost every single one of these particular people, we will find that, in fact, when they were children, teenagers, young adults, they picked up a book or watched a movie or a TV series about the future, usually the genre of sci-fi, and that inspired them to set out and build a certain future. Now, why that is a problem? It's a problem because future frameworks that we have for now in any kind of mainstream format, except for the new emergent science fiction writing, and some of the smaller science fiction sort of animated comic, etc. projects, have been entirely anchored in deeply racist, misogynist, settler colonial, capitalist culture. And on the both sides of it, so not just dystopias, you know, so what are dystopias ultimately? Dystopias are futures that are so bad that we feel that there's nothing that can be done about it. The problem with it, though, they were intentionally designed or imagined to be cautionary tales. So sort of warnings for us to not go a certain pathway. What have they become, though, in the present moment is very much either desperate escapism or product roadmap. So a whole lot of the times, even with a TV series such as Black Mirror, somebody looks at it and is like, oh, wow, this is really terrible, but this particular tech could make a lot of money. So why not? I'm just going to go and cash in from it. And on the other side, what it does to the general population, it makes us feel that certain realities are inevitable. And I don't know if Pinar was referring to Ursula Le Guin's capitalist quote, but that's what Ursula Le Guin speaks about, is that, you know, at some point in history, the rule of kings seemed sort of a divine right. And so today, capitalism seems, and settler colonial capitalism seems like an inevitable condition. But culture can and should be changed, and the change starts with imagination. So now let's look at what is sort of that reverse side of a coin, or previously seen as alternative to dystopia. And that is utopia. But what is the problem with utopia? Utopias are sort of this colonial fever dream, designed most of the time from top down by people that would only include the ones that are very much like them. They have been profoundly uninclusive of disability, hence the eugenic movements of the entire 20th century, of queerness, of multiculturalism, and in general of any kind of emergent subcultures, youth culture, and anything that desires to question its paradigms. So we have to remember that historically, Nazi Germany was a utopia for the Nazis. We have to remember that apartheid was a utopia for the propagators of apartheid. You know, Soviet Union was a utopia for people that believed in that communist construct. But it was absolutely a dystopia for millions of people, especially to the indigenous populations of the North and Siberia that were submitted to an absolutely comparable violence that was exercised upon indigenous people in North America. So both of these frameworks are entirely insufficient for us to create and chart any kind of pathway towards a future that we would like to inhabit. And today, with everything that's happening, the pandemic, the financial crisis is going to ensure a potential collapse of entire nation states. What we need more than anything is futures that would activate a feeling of hope within us. And for me, that framework is protopia. So we're coming to that, can we go a little bit more towards no is not enough? Keep the nostalgia is poison still in the shot. So what I wanted to say is that a lot of utopias, a lot of dystopias, they essentially reproduce the frameworks of the past. And they look and they inspire themselves from some kind of idealized idea of what we have been and tries to reproduce it. And sometimes, and I often say, F word, techno-fetishism, because that is also not an alternative to trying to go back. It's not about going backwards. It's not about mindlessly going forward. And it's not about just saying no, no, no. It's really about finding the common yeses. And so for me, my ongoing research into what could be those common yeses, centering previously unheard, not voiceless, but previously unheard, deliberately unheard, marginalized voices, especially from intersectional marginalization experience. So indigeneity, queerness, disability, forward. Those are, and can we slide now towards the protopian future points? The big image. And for me, that is the only way to really think about inclusive futures if we center ourselves not on the voices of privilege, but the voices of marginalization. So Protopia is really about proactive prototyping of an inclusive future that is continuously being iterated upon. It's not a dead end. It's not a final idea of anything. As we move forward with any one thing, we discover more of the problems, and we need to think of more of the solutions, because the consequences of our actions keep following us. Even if tomorrow we become entirely environmentally aware, we still have to deal with all of the microplastics, with all of the carbon in the atmosphere, with all of nuclear waste, right? So what Protopia really is about, and I want to go through, let me see how much time I have. I want to go through points that Protopian futures try to explore. And I'll be very, very curious if anybody wants to keep adding to the spreadsheet. What are the other points? Or maybe what are the specifications of these points that I haven't had the chance to cover in the presentation? So the point number one is plurality. And plurality truly beyond the binaries. It's not just about, including people of a particular skin tone that have been less included in the past. It's about also recognizing that it's not just black and white. That are all the tonalities and all the cultures in between, and so many of us are third culture people, meaning that our parents might be from different cultures. We might have been born into a certain place or from a certain place and lived in another place, and so that plurality of culture is not just in the world, it's also within ourselves, and we have to honor that. And in some cases, like in my very own case, I was born in a country that doesn't exist anymore, which is Soviet Union. My cultural roots extend from the Baltic Sea all the way to the very other side, the Okhotsk Sea, right? So the very, very other side of Asia. And so many of that identity has been erased due to political reality in which I was born. And that's very, very important to recognize the space in between that sometimes is very hard to speak about. And that space in between is not just cultural, it's also the one of gender, and the one of sexuality, and the one of ability and disability. It's not one of zeros, it's really entire shading and complexity, and nothing is ever fixed, right? It's imagining a future where gender representation includes the mobility within not just the gender spectrum as sort of, 0 to 100%, but entire sort of space around what gender can be, right? So now we move to the point number 2, which is community narratives beyond the borders. When we think of most of the science fiction, we think of these singular heroes that are trying to save the world. A lot of sort of superhero genre is anchored in that. And then we are surprised when somebody, as absurd as it seems to us, like Donald Trump, goes up on stage and says that only I, can save America. And right now, with the spread of, conspiracies, and especially this new crazy genre of conspirituality, which is a merger, of sort of racist, sexist, homophobic, anti-Semitic, right-wing conspiracies together, merging together with sort of all that sort of colonial new agey spirituality. Two things that are not really that far from each other, but seemed far to a lot of people. What we are seeing, for example, in QAnon, is this deification of Donald Trump as the savior of the world from this evil cabal, which obviously even in the name cabal doesn't try to hide itself from being profoundly anti-Semitic conspiracy. But all that stuff goes back to the notion that most of our narratives about the future and solutions to whatever our future problems have been deeply anchored in that singular hero journey. So who is a protopian hero? Protopian hero is us. It's us coming together. It's a community. And it's a community that is brought together not through tolerance of each other's difference, but truly through embracing our plurality and our diversity. The next point is celebration of life and physical presence. We have to understand that 20th century futurism, which started with Italian Futurist Manifesto, glorified speed and mechanical technology and despised biological life, despised womanhood also profoundly. And so celebration of life and physical presence is really about embracing biology and recognizing life and biological systems and ecosystems as technology, and honoring that also in the technologies that we design and the urban imagination that we create for our cities, and the urban planning that we do accordingly, not just on the basis of sort of engineering, but really ecosystem thinking. And that also speaks to, celebration of life and biological technologies also speaks about physical presence, and how we think of technologies that don't just facilitate certain tasks, but really facilitate connection, and facilitate connection not just with each other human peoples, but also, what Pinar spoke to, and what I and most indigenous cultures we speak about as more than human peoples. Right, so it's also sort of that interspecies connection to technologies. So we should create a kind of technology that supports that, and that is a protopian stance. Which leads us to environmental awareness. So really thinking how nature and natural systems, materials that are not anchored in fossil fuels, but in regenerative ecosystem way of design and way of actually just being into being, symbiotically being together. What does that kind of world look like? When there's no more separation between natural environment and an urban environment, where the two can actually merge together and support each other. Which then again leads to the next point, evolution of values. Right now, when we think of most science fiction, it is still moved by, the drama is still moved by the pursuits that we identify with contemporary civilizational pursuits, where success is measured by how much can I possess, how much can I own, rather than how much I contribute. So evolution of values is really about moving away from culture of exploitation towards culture of contribution, which again centers indigeneity, because that's what's been at the core of most indigenous cultures. Sorry. which leads us to spirituality and ritual, and recognizing how for all of us as peoples, ritual and spirituality is incredibly important and is a backbone of our culture, and of all the cultures of all of peoples, human and non-human peoples. And and recognizing that in the absence of that, what starts happening is this new cults, again, as QAnon and so many others that we've seen, obsessions and different emergence of cults, though never they have been as potent to reach their followers as they are today with digital technologies. They get to fill in that vacuum. Right, so we need to really think what type of rituals and what kind of spirituality can support regenerative culture of the future. And then the last point that is truly one of the most important for me, as somebody with a creative background that then gone into technology and research and futurism, is creativity and subculture, and really think what role creativity and what kind of subcultures emerge around that in the future, and how creativity is not identified anymore with just conventionally artistic disciplines, but really expands our understanding that everything that is about imagining a world that can be is actually an act of creativity. And as Adrienne Maria Brown speaks about, all organizing the science fiction, imagining a world of possibilities, imagining a change is a creative act, and it's an act of creation of a future. And let's just go to the last quotes on the other side. So, I really believe that the work of caring is the work of the future. And it's all really about symbiosis and symbiotic being together. And it's about imagining tenderness in a future tense. Let's go to the last images at the very bottom. And I think this particular image on the left sort of really exemplifies that. And it speaks to what Australian author and Indigenous activist Tyson Yunkaporta speaks about in his phenomenal book, Sand Talk, that human way or settler colonial way of trying to get things in a straight line in the fastest way possible underestimates the importance of everything that could be encountered in between, and the kind of meandering and the kind of wondering that is crucial to us as human beings, that is part of learning, that is part of respect of the natural world, that sometimes we can't and we should not even attempt to get to things in the straightest line possible, because we are biological creatures and biology doesn't go in a straight line. And then the very last image illustrates one of the first collaborations that I've done with an artist, Mario Mimosho, as part of at Protopia Futures, which is right now an Instagram account and a Twitter account, but is becoming a whole lot of other things. We're working towards TV series. We're starting to host these interactive podcasts on this new app called Clubhouse. We're working towards a podcast series to, again, explore these futures of hope. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Monica. Brilliant. I went to one of these Clubhouse events the other day. I got a new app. Monica convinced me to get a new app, and I'm always very resistant to getting new apps. And it was great. It was interesting hearing about the future.
Wow.
Future
I'm
of education.
actually dumbfounded. Tobias hates
We've only got a few minutes for some questions. So one's come in already. I'm just going to read it straight out, and I guess I'm going to throw it open potentially to Monica or Pinar to address. And this is from Laura, who sent this in. As we face the current ecological breakdown, many philosophers, scientists, thinkers persist that we need to think of new alternative worlds and ways of being as the idea of Gaia instead of trying to create the world that was. What's your take on that? What would be your own vision of Gaia, or of a regenerative world where humans and non-humans co-live? And just quickly while you're thinking of the answers, if you now click Ask Questions Live, if you're in the audience, it will direct you into the spreadsheet so you can get in on the discussion page, put in any notes or ideas, ask any questions in there. So Pinar or Monica, the idea of your own vision of Gaia, a regenerative world where humans and non-humans co-live.
Does Pinar want to start, or should I?
Go ahead, Monica.
Yeah, so I feel it's quite problematic because although, as I said, nostalgia is poison, and we should not be attempting to sort of idealize the past or go back. At the same time, it's very, very important to know history. And even more important is to know histories that have been erased by the so-called winners. And so in most of these cases, these were settler colonial civilizations. So I think what is really vital today is to support the work of preservation, uncovering, and regeneration of indigenous knowledge, because so many solutions actually are there. And it's not about recreating those types of being. It's not about exotifying and idolizing them. It's really about working together with it. Instead of thinking that we are inventing something entirely new, especially as people who represent settler colonial cultures or have been anchored or grown up in settler colonial culture setting, we have to realize that most of the wisdom exists within indigenous framework. So much of what we're talking about, gender, most indigenous cultures had a gender that was much more open than just a binary. So much of sort of ecosystem thinking, so much of the sort of teaching and learning system, a lot of that stuff actually, has been at the very core of indigenous thinking. And so I think it's important sort of to look at it, and also to look at the bleeding edge of science and technology, and see how these two things can truly meet, again, honoring previously erased and marginalized voices. And again, thinking that experience of marginalization actually makes us much more acutely aware. And whatever marginalization that is, right? In a heteronormative society, it is the queer community that understands best in which way heteronormativity hurts us. And overall, in the world in general, our civilization is completely anchored and mired by ableism. And so if we center the understandings from disability community, not only that we will make the world that is better for disabled people, but we'll make a more inclusive world for all of us.
Now, we've got about 1 minute. Have you got any thoughts? Very quickly, how do you regenerate the world to completely reorientate the relation between humans and non-humans?
We won't be able to, because when was the Gaia theory presented? Wasn't it like 1970s? Just correct me if I'm wrong.
70s, yeah.
Right, yeah, so 70s. Let's look at the world population back then, and now it's doubled, right? So that whole thing doesn't work anymore. I mean, for me, one of the big realizations during COVID was that, oh, wait, we really went beyond this point where we thought things could be, we talk about reversing, etc., regenerating. We won't be able to. If 90% of fish has left the oceans, and this is now, and we're still building fish farms and, killing dolphins and whales, etc., how are we going to recover this? So it's not going to happen. We need to accept this. Right. And I think anybody who is having tendencies like this group is having, has the responsibility to do more research and to speak up, and to perhaps dedicate half of their time in, supporting and cultivating this kind of culture. So the cultures as we know it, and the ones that Monica are talking about, we also erase them. We lost the cultural values. Things have changed so much. So now we also need to design it. One really interesting thing is that when you kill an ecosystem, like, take the pollinators out, then you have to do the work of the pollinators yourself to continue maintaining the balance, right? So we erased those things, and now we have extra work to do to make sure that we're not losing everything. So I don't want to sound too alarming, and maybe I actually do want to sound too alarming, I don't know, but there's no Gaia anymore. It's just those theories don't apply to our current day. Things change super fast. So we'll have to think faster, and we'll have to think different things in different ways. I think that's where I can end, because we have 1 minute.
Yeah, well, there's something almost hypocritical about using a framework to challenge a framework, isn't there? I mean, the problem is maybe the existence of frameworks, and
yeah.
Can I add something to that and maybe counter some of it? I don't entirely agree with that. I agree that the situation is not the same, and I agree that we are obviously so overpopulated. But in fact, there still are indigenous communities that, you know what I mean? It's not all gone, and even in the way that I personally grew up, being deeply connected, when I go to US, and the way I recognize the plants and plant medicines, and that just seems completely automatic for me. People think like I'm very spiritual or something like that, but it's just part of my culture. It's just part of who I am. It's just in my bones. And so somebody saying to me that something like that, does not exist, it does. So, it really, really does. And we need to recognize where it does exist, and we need to keep elevating those voices, because as long as we say, if we stick to that dystopian framework that nothing can be done, then things happen like just happened in Australia, where the 4 Direction Street, Jaburun, got cut off, to make, a way for a highway.
Well, I really like this, do we have time?
We literally can't, because they're going to change the channel in a second, and we'll just be cut.
Okay. I second Monica is what I want to say. I don't want to come off as dystopian, because I'm not. Otherwise, I wouldn't be making this work. Thank you.
Yeah. The plurality of ideas is important. Okay, we do have to go. We've gone over time. The folks at IMPAKT are nagging me. They're being very kind about it, but they want to go to the next event. Thank you so much, Pinar and Monica, for joining us. It was really interesting to get both of you together, actually, and see your perspectives as an admirer of your work for a while now. Natalie, is there anything you'd like to quickly sum up?
It's a horrible chimera object that's now living in the spreadsheet. And
the spreadsheet will remain accessible for all the links and stuff, but we will turn off editing shortly. So you'll be able to get to it, so you can see all the material, but we won't allow editing much longer. So do spend some time in it. Thank you again and again and again. This was weird, but I think it worked. And we'll try it again better, differently next time. Thanks, Pinar and Monica. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Reach out for any Protopia ideas and questions, and let's do it together.
Do it. Bye, IMPAKT. Bye. I miss you.
Miss you. Oh, someone did a macro. Oh, I thought they were color changing. Oh.
Thank you. That was such a great panel. And welcome back to IMPAKT TV, or welcome back. We're actually closing the program for today. Today, it's the end of the program of more than 10 hours of IMPAKT TV only for today. And we're also nearing the end of the festival, sadly. But tomorrow we have the final day in which we look back at the last few days. And so, if you want, you can join Ion and me from the IMPAKT studio tomorrow. We have to say goodbye to our production crew, and I want to invite them on stage because they've been here in front of me